Now we're going to start discussing the treaties which officially ended World War I. We're going to start by looking at the representatives that attended the Paris Peace Conference, which started in January 1919 and lasted for 6 weeks. Although it was attended by representatives of 32 nations, as you can see on the screen, it was primarily the decisions of what was known as the Big Three that determined what the treaties were going to look like in the end. These three individuals were Woodrow Wilson, representing the United States, Georges Clemenceau, representing France, and David Lloyd George, representing Great Britain. Japan and Italy also had representatives at the Paris Peace Conference, but since their goals were primarily for territorial gains, they did not have much of a say in the overall outcome of the treaties. And in fact, Italy at one point walked out of the Paris Peace Conference because they were not getting what they had been promised when they joined the Allies. Let's take a look at some of the factors that the Big Three had to be concerned about in making these peace treaties that resolved the First World War. You can see these factors at the bottom of your screen here, and they included things like secret treaties. Most of these representatives at the Paris Peace Conference realized those secretive agreements that Bismarck was known for prior to World War I just caused a lot of tension and speculation between countries and did not promote international cooperation at all. These treaties did not need to be a part of future negotiations between countries. Wilson, in fact, was all for the idea of open diplomacy, which was one of his 14 points, which we'll talk about later. I think everyone at the Paris Peace Conference realized that secretive treaties would be detrimental to the peace process and should be banned in the future. Another factor that the Big Three had to be concerned about was the creation of new states, especially in Central Europe, where old empires of Austria-Hungary and the Ottomans were broken apart and formed into new nations such as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. These new nations, although given independence and self-determination in being created, also had to deal with getting on their feet and forming stability, which was not an easy task. The Big Three had to be aware of the challenges that these new states were being presented with and how best to assist them into gaining a solid foundation. Obviously, the fact that Russia had turned communist was something that many of these representatives, especially the Big Three, were concerned about. The Big Three were still resentful of the Russians making a separate peace treaty with Germany before World War I ended and basically leaving the Allies hanging. So there was a lot of concern over what should be done with Russia, especially now that they were communist, and the Big Three had governments that were directly opposite to communism. I discussed in the previous recording that the United States had a definite fear of communism as we were having internal issues in our own country and targeting those who were suspected communists or anarchists for intense scrutiny and even mistreatment. There was definitely a desire that communism in general be contained to Russia, which was now on the verge of becoming the Soviet Union, and that the ideas of socialism and communism not spread to other countries. So therefore, some of the Big Three wanted to make sure that Germany, while being punished, could stand as a strong bulwark against the spread of communism in the future. These Big Three had a lot of bitterness towards the enemy nations of the Central Powers, specifically the French and the British. Wilson was much more lenient towards the enemy nations, and a lot of that had to do with the fact that we were not damaged to the extent that France and Britain were. Therefore, we didn't have the same level of bitterness and resentment towards them. But there was definitely a tight line to be walked by these Big Three over how much of this bitterness should be unleashed on Germany and the other Central Powers, which also leads into this bottom point here. As we've seen with the role-playing activity and when you looked at pages 71 to 73, the Big Three were coming to the Paris Peace Conference with different objectives and different desires from the people that they represented in their countries. Therefore, it would be very difficult for the peacemakers to solidify a peace treaty which would be satisfactory to all. It's pretty unfair to blame these peacemakers for not creating a lasting peace because the issues in Europe were so complex after World War I. It's difficult to imagine that anybody could have fully created a treaty that would have resolved all the issues and prevented another war from breaking out in the future. These peacemakers could not foresee what was going to come in the future. We can look back and see the rise of Hitler and other dictators such as Mussolini and see where along the road they could have been stopped. But it's impossible to assume that these peacemakers could have done the same thing. If you were to get an essay question about the results of World War I and the short-sightedness of the treaties, you could effectively argue that it's impossible to hold these people accountable for not creating a lasting peace. They simply could not grasp all of the complex issues that were going on in the world following the conclusion of World War I. Now let's take a look at Wilson's 14 points. He was definitely the most idealistic person at the Paris Peace Conference, and he had set in his mind a list of factors that he felt would prevent another worldwide war from taking place in the future. If you look on page 71 of your book, you can see exactly what these 14 points entailed, every single one of them. But basically, they can be broken down into three themes that you see on the screen. The idea of granting national independence to peoples that had been a part of European colonies. The idea of self-determination and allowing these people to govern themselves for the first time and to have a say in their own future. That was one major theme of some of these 14 points. Another theme that Wilson had running throughout his 14 points was the idea of open diplomacy. Like we've mentioned, most of the representatives at the Paris Peace Conference realized that secretive alliances were detrimental. And Wilson definitely felt that in the future, trade should be open and negotiations. Countries should feel like they had a forum to come to when there were issues coming up. And going along with that, that countries should be willing to disarm themselves to promote a sense of international peace. If countries did not have the stockpiles of weapons and huge numbers of troops to fall back on, they would be more likely to work together in cooperation rather than resort to war. Finally, the last main theme, which goes with point number 14 of his 14 points, was the creation of an international association of nations, which ended up being called the League of Nations. The idea behind this was that countries could have that forum that I discussed in open diplomacy, where they could present issues that were of concern or in conflict with other nations, and hopefully come to peaceful agreements rather than resort to war as a tool of diplomacy. Wilson was very passionate about this idea of a League of Nations and campaigned across the United States after coming home from the Paris Peace Conference to try to get the people of the U.S. on board with the idea. However, there was too much feeling of isolationism among the American people, along with the internal issues that I've already discussed, that in the end, our own country did not vote to become a part of the League of Nations, even though it was our own president's idea to begin with. Historians have often criticized Woodrow Wilson for being way too idealistic or even to the point of naivety with these 14 points, that they were simply not realistic given the conditions that Europe was facing after World War I and the feelings of bitterness and revenge that were apparent in some of the other Allied countries like France. These 14 points just simply would not be practical. They're very good ideas on paper, but they just were not going to work out to Wilson's desire. Now we're going to take a look at the main treaty that was created in Paris in 1919, which dealt with the country of Germany, and it is the Treaty of Versailles. It's the most well-known of all the treaties and the most discussed as far as being a factor leading up to World War II. In the Treaty of Versailles, we know that France had the most reason to be vengeful towards the Germans. Georges Clemenceau had a great deal of anger and frustration that he wanted to have taken out in the final peace treaty. He wanted Germany to be hammered with punishments and basically wanted to make sure that they could never again threaten the safety and security of the French people. If you look at the top of page 75, the Treaty of Versailles, which was designed after 6 weeks of intense negotiations, did not allow the German government any say whatsoever in the acceptance of it. They were forced to sign it, you can see at the top of 75, in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, which is where the Germans had proclaimed the German Empire 50 years earlier following the Franco-Prussian War. That right there shows you the revenge that was being unleashed on the Germans. And then underneath the factor right here about the treaty having those seeds of revenge in Germany, you can see what the treaty exactly spelled out for the German people. And it's important to understand each of these terms and why they planted seeds of revenge among the German people that Hitler used to his advantage years later. Basically, it boils down to three main terms. Germany had to lose all past conquests in Europe, Asia, and Africa. If you look back at the bottom on page 74 at the map, you can see the areas in Europe that Germany was going to have to give up. Plus, its overseas colonies were taken by countries like we know, Japan. Finally, Germany was forced to accept the war guilt clause, which basically entailed that there were going to be trials set up for leaders of the German government and military because they were forced to say that they had been the ones who started the war, even though we know that there were other countries and issues involved in the causes. Also, the Germans were forced to pay reparations, which is financial punishment for being held accountable for starting a war to the Allies. The Germans could not pay these reparations. They were to the extreme, and that is something else that planted seeds of revenge among the German people. If you look from pages 75 through 77, you can see the exact details of these different terms of the treaty spelled out for you, along with a map at the top of page 76, which shows the territorial changes resulting from this treaty. It's really important that you take time to go through these pages, 75 to 77, and outline in your notes the specific details of these terms of the treaty so that you can have a full understanding of what the German people were having to face at the end of the war. You could also consider doing the review questions in the student study section on page 77 as well to give you further understanding of the terms of the treaty and be prepared to discuss them in class. In class, we'll be looking at the contemporary response to the Treaty of Versailles from people living at the time, criticisms of the Treaty of Versailles both at that time and since then from different historians' work. But finally, we're going to end this recording with looking at the other settlements and treaties that were made, which targeted the other members of the Central Powers after World War I. You can see that these other Central Power nations, including Austria, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Turkey, all faced similar punishments to Germany in the Treaty of Versailles. They all had to disarm, pay reparations, and lose territory. So let's take a quick look at the specific territories for each of these countries, starting with the Treaty of Saint-Germain, which punished Austria. At this point, Austria and Hungary were broken apart into two separate nations, and they were forbidden from reuniting in the future in what was known as the Anschluss. The Anschluss forbade Austria from reuniting with Germany as an ally in the future, like they had prior to World War I. And you can see on the screen here, and what I mentioned in class, that proportionately, Austria faced the most severe punishment of all the treaties, even though we hear mostly about the Treaty of Versailles that punished Germany. You can see on page 82 the specific details of Austria as far as which specific territories that they lost and how much they were disarmed. The Treaty of Trianon is what punished Hungary, which was now broken apart from Austria, and you can see the details of that directly underneath the details about the Treaty of Saint-Germain on page 82. Again, the idea of disarmament, paying reparations, and losing territory. The Treaty of Neuilly punished the country of Bulgaria, and as you remember, they joined in the Central Powers after the war had started, and they were a part of that issue in the Balkans back when we discussed the Bulgarian crisis of the 1870s. Finally, the Treaty of Sevres, which was also revised with the Treaty of Lausanne, affected the country of Turkey, which had been a part of that former Ottoman Empire, and you can see the details for that treaty on page 83 of your book, and also on page 84. Just like with the Treaty of Versailles, there was a great deal of criticism of these other treaties that punished these former members of the Central Powers located in Eastern and Southeastern Europe. You can see basically what the criticisms boil down to here. It's very difficult to apply the principle of self-determination consistently and fairly, as far as giving formerly oppressed peoples their own say in their own government. These new states, like we mentioned before, were weak politically and economically, which would make them vulnerable, and these treaties led to more resentment and bitterness maybe than what was started with. We'll go over this more in class as far as these criticisms, but you can notice the historian Alan Sharp on page 84 in his view about what these treaties caused. We'll be discussing his viewpoint, and his viewpoint would be a good one to consider in an essay regarding the treaties of World War I. So overall, the treaties created in Paris in January of 1919, although what was thought at the time to be sufficient punishments, actually caused a great deal of problems in the future that would eventually lead to the outbreak of World War II.